beauty of procedural shading is I have some little, somewhere on my computer, I have some little renders I did from earlier. But basically, it's a really convenient way to sort of modularly design textures. I closed Photoshop, shoot. In a way that's relatively easy to modify. So like, this is the same shader ball I did. I was just like playing with the textures earlier. And I only used one map from this, and it's a generic scratch map from the internet. The rest of this was done with procedural texturing. So like adding this dust stuff on top, these little scratches around here, the rust down here. You'll notice I did not UV my object before I did this, because this looks terrible. But all of this was done with procedural texturing. And the beauty of that is that I can actually go in and like assign that to a different material. So in this case, just my silly little head that I use for everything. And this is the exact same texture, just on my head. And you'll notice that like it still has nice rust in all the corners, like dust sitting on top of it. And that's kind of the power of procedural texturing. It'll just look nice on many objects that you apply it to. So, yeah. I also, in case anyone was interested, I happen to fiddle with toon shading in Maya a little bit. So I can go over this at the end of class if there's time, or next week, or whatever. But weird spinning toon shaded thing. But yeah, so procedural texturing, if you're not already like familiar with the Hypershade, you are going to be after this week's assignment. Like it or not. All right, hang on. I'm gonna actually find my notes. So really quick, I'm just gonna, here's the, I'm gonna save this, because Maya's gonna crash on me. All right, anywho, blah. All right, so again, this is the Hypershade. I pulled this up before in class, but here it is again. So you should be familiar, like all the materials are listed up here. This is like the little node editor thing. Basically just a mini version of your actual node editor. And this is what we're gonna be using most of today and like for this week's assignments to do things. So I'll go over a little bit more how to actually work here. If you need to organize your nodes, like if you just, have a bunch of weird stuff just floating around like this and you just wanna clear everything out, there's this little white box with these 3 blue stars in it. Hit that, it's just gonna clear everything out of here so you have a clean space to work. So if you need to get a material down here, you can just middle mouse button drag it down. It's gonna show up here. You can click on it, move it around if you need to. And then this little button here is going to expand it and show you the inner and outer connections, or like the connections forward and anything that's being input into it. These buttons here are gonna show you only the stuff being input into the material. This one's gonna show you only the stuff being output. And then if you need to, so if you don't wanna like click and drag this down, you can just select your object or your material and hit this little plus button here. That's going to just add it in somewhere kind of randomly into your node editor. And then if you decide that you need to get rid of one of these, like maybe you don't need car paint anymore, you can just select that and hit this little minus button, and that's going to remove it. If you only need to move like one thing at once. Sometimes I hide these stupid like surface SG nodes because I don't use them when I'm working with them for the most part, and they just sort of get in the way. And then the other thing to be aware of is this little hamburger menu. It's going to collapse, expand your different nodes, which can be helpful if you're looking for textures. You can also, with one of these selected, hit 1, 2, 3, or 4, and it's going to just toggle between the different levels of expandedness. Honestly, I just use the hamburger because I'm lazy. That's pretty much how you function in the node editor. You navigate around the same way you do in Maya, so like scroll wheel works. And then if you need to like pan around, you can just do Alt and middle mouse button drag, and you can just move around like that. Sometimes you do get a lot of nodes where you do actually kind of have to scroll between them. But that's pretty much that. Any questions on that? All right. Cool. So, without further ado, let's jump into some basic procedural texturing. So working in Arnold, I'm gonna show you most of the stuff in Arnold, jump into Redshift, show you pretty much like two comparable ways of doing stuff in Redshift. And then if you guys are interested, we'll do toon shading. If not, we can do that whenever or not at all. So the first thing, basically my goal is to create something where, imagine I'm going for a shipped paint effect where you have like a car that's been painted and then someone like digs their key across it because you've offended them somehow, and now you can see the metal beneath your paint. Don't know why that was the first thing I went to, but so I'm just going to hit tab. I have my cursor in the node editor. Going to hit tab. It's going to bring up this little search bar, and then I'm just going to type in mix. And what I'm going to be working with is the AI mix shader, and I'm pretty much going to be using these like 80 bajillion times the next 5 minutes, so get used to typing in tab and mix. I'm just going to take this. In case you weren't aware, if you're in your Hypershade, you can actually just middle mouse button and drag like a texture onto an object, and it's going to automatically assign that to said object, which is handy if you're lazy and hate using menu buttons, which is pretty much the story of my life. So I'm just going to grab this mix shader, and I'm going to drag it onto my object. And it shows up blank because I haven't mapped anything into it yet. And I would like to stress now, and I'll probably say it 20 more times, that it is very important when doing procedural texturing to name your things correctly and logically, because you're going to end up with like 40 nodes, and if you don't label them, you're going to cry yourself to sleep for a week. So anyway, I'm just going to enable this mix and scratches. So yeah, I personally like labeling my mix shaders with like mix in front, because that way I know it's a mix shader, and I have all my base textures. So I have like blue metal, I have car paint, I have dust, which looks terrible, and I have this awkward rust texture that I made. So these are all just like base textures that I have, and I'm basically going to be using them as almost as if like they're layers in Photoshop, where I'm going to basically use maps to show one versus the other. So with this mix shader, I'm going for rusty car paint, so I'm going to drag in my car paint node, throw that on shader 1, and I have no chrome, so I'm going to turn blue metal into chrome, cough. Actually, I might just change my color of my car paint to be like, I don't know, how do we feel about this like hideous purple color? It's gonna be amazing. Actually, I'm gonna make a new shader and just call it chrome. Stop being lazy about it, just do it. All right. Wow, presets. Chrome, all the chrome. All right, and I'm just gonna make that rougher. Cool, because nobody likes super shiny chrome, except for me, because it's glorious. All right, so here's my texture. And I'm just gonna take this AI standard surface, which I forgot to call chrome. I'm gonna take that and just drag it down into my mix shader. I'm just gonna replace, so if I drag this down and just mouse it on top of shader 2, it's just going to replace blue metal. So this is basically what my mix shader looks like right now. It's this combination of the sort of blue car paint material and my chrome. And you'll notice that it's basically doing, it kind of looks like a weird combination. It's not quite chrome, it's not quite my blue. So why did I set the specular color to hot pink? Oh, I see what I've done. I was going for this color. That makes more sense. All right, sorry. All right, so if I'm, so if I take my mix shader, I set the weight all the way to 0, it's going to show me the car paint, and if I set it all the way to chrome, it's going to show me chrome. If I do something in between, it's going to be like this awkward sort of pinkish kind of chromey material, which is awkward. So in the same way that we've been mapping in weight for transmission for like clear glass, if I put a map on this mix here, you can see that I just threw a checker texture on, and it's going to basically display my object, you know, parts that are car paint and parts that are chrome. I'm going to really quickly go through and just replace, I have a UV'd shader ball, which I'm going to put in because it will look better in the end. So you do still need to UV your stuff, even if you are procedurally texturing it. It's easier to get away with less in-depth UVs, so like if you must, you could apply like an automatic map to this. I would still encourage you to do nice UVs, but you could do an automatic map and more or less get away with it. But yeah. So the cool thing about mix shaders is they allow you to really, really easily switch between materials without having to recreate your maps. So like if I decided I didn't want this chrome in here and I wanted it to actually be like rust, I can just replace my rust, and oh, I see what that is. And it's done. So it's a really convenient way to just like make a generic texture in Maya and then swap out textures without needing to go into Photoshop and like update, you know, your bump map and your roughness map and your color map and like all of these maps. You can basically just update your masks for the objects if you're using like file masks. Does this make sense? Cool. I'm gonna assume that's a yes. All right. So one really fun, kind of dumb, silly, quick thing that you can do really quick. I'm gonna break this connection, and I'm just gonna throw my my blue metal in for this car paint. I'm gonna throw in a ramp texture on this. So if you guys have ever seen, if anyone's familiar with like Damascus Steel, which is a very random thing, but it's like basically they like layer metal on top of each other and like hammer it. It's crazy, but it gives you this like really neat sort of wiggly effect. In case you guys weren't aware, you can actually create a similar effect with a ramp shader. So if I go in here and I just play with my noise, what are you doing? All right. I'm gonna play with like noise and frequency, but you can pretty much create that sort of like odd texture there as well. I might, you know, tweak the black in a little bit. And I can, if I wanted to, kind of make that like weird sort of wiggly look on my, here's a nice ramp that I have used for this that I made in my last class. But you can kind of create that sort of Damascus Steel look if you want by playing with ramps. And you can get really trippy, weird effects on them. For some reason, if you decide that this is a good idea, you could like apply this ridiculous wiggly texture to it. I don't know. You can do a lot of weird stuff with procedural texturing, and it's fun to play with. I like ramp shaders too. Anywho, so more practically, going back to my mix shader, I'm going to assign my car paint back to it. And again, you can see why this is like nice to have everything labeled, because I'm just like, I know exactly what I'm looking for. I'm like, cool, car paint, done. So what I can do, just for like the most basic example, I'm just going to grab, like I said, that generic file texture or like scratch texture I use from the interwebs, which is hopefully in my source images thing, and it is. And once I check alpha's luminance, you can see that it's basically scratching. I always set my stuff up the wrong way because I'm a dingus, but it's basically scratching my chrome to reveal car paint. So what I'm going to do really quick is just grab this. I'm just going to repeat that texture a few times to make the scratches a little bit finer and less grainy and awkward looking. And again, that's just in the 2D, Place 2D texture node. That's pretty much automatically applied when you create a file texture. So already we see this kind of looks scratchy. I'm just going to go through and swap out my materials. I could invert my texture, which is probably the more logical thing to do, but whatever. So now we have scratched up car paint. And again, this is the beauty of a mix shader, because it's really simple to go in, and if I want to, I can just switch all my textures out and turn this into something really crazy. And you'll also notice, like, even just doing the relatively minimal stuff that I've done here, go away. Oh, so much nicer. I have my node editor has become kind of messy and horrifying, so I'm just going to clear this out really quick. So I'm going to basically show you another way to do this that gives you a slightly different effect. So I'm going to make another mix shader, and again, I'm just hitting tab to access that little search bar. And this time I'm going to shoot for, if you've ever seen like an object that's been used a lot of times there'll be little chips around the edge of stuff. So I'm going to try to recreate that. So I'm going to go car paint and bad. I threw car paint into the displacement, and I'm like, no. I'm actually kind of curious what would have happened, but not curious enough to actually render it. All right. And again, I'm just going to throw this onto my texture ball. And I'm going to rename this mix edge scratch. All right. So again, I have like my shaders input, and this is kind of where procedural texturing gets really interesting, because you're not reliant on like file textures to do stuff. So if I hit tab, I'm going to look for, I'm just going to start typing curvature, and you're looking for the AI curvature node if anyone's following along. So what this will do, if I'm actually just going to make another surface shader so you guys can just see exactly what this is doing. Oops. Oh, yeah. So this is basically what my curvature node looks like. This is just mapped out into the color of a surface shader. So basically what it's doing is it's looking at, it's doing some weird math stuff to calculate the curvature of the object. But effectively what it's doing is like highlighting, the sharper the corner on the object, the more it's highlighted white. So you'll notice it does pretty much highlight like all the sharp edges on this object. It's highlighting these a little bit because this is kind of more rounded. And then it's catching like all of these corners down here. So you can use this as a mask for your mix shader to basically mask off areas and make it look like the edges are all kind of chipped off crazy. Which is honestly quite a cool effect. So there's a few like random settings in your curvature node you can fiddle with. There's like radius if you want to make it ginormous. Spread, you can pull it back in a little bit tighter. There's like a bunch of different settings you can play with. I'm just gonna, for now, be like, cool, this doesn't look completely horrific to me. I guess that's good. But yeah, again, a bunch of settings. So I'm just gonna detach that. It doesn't really matter. So I'm gonna grab the out color for this curvature node here, and I'm going to drag it into my mix. You'll notice when I did that, it actually grayed out mix, and it's like, you can't connect that? No. If you guys ever get that error where, again, you're just like trying to drag something and it's like, no. What's probably happening is, in this case, so out color has values for RGB, and mix only wants a single value. So if I just grab any of these RG or B channels, really doesn't matter which, and I throw that into my mix shader, it's going to let me attach that. And since these are all probably going to end up being the same, like numerically these are all going to be the same because of how the curvature node works, it doesn't matter which one you grab. So if I apply my standard mix shader again, god dang it, I always set it up backwards. Every time. I was like, oh, I'm going to set it up right this time, and then literally every time I set one of these up, I have to swap these. But you can see that it's basically sort of creating the effect that there's areas on here where it's the paint has sort of worn off the edges. So it's a really fun way to sort of add, again, procedural grime to your stuff.
And we're using AI mix shader, right?
Yep. Yes. Yes.
Where are you putting the mask? Like, is it under the mix weight?
Yeah, it is.
So you just put the little box and then you put in the files?
So I've actually been dragging, so these little like arrow things in here, you can drag these around and manipulate them. So like I disconnected that. So right now, there's nothing mapped into mix weight. If I grab this little R value and just, I'm just clicking on this bubble and like dragging it in, basically, you'll notice that as soon as that's connected, it's actually mapped that R value into the mix weight. So that's just like how I'm connecting stuff. There's like a bunch of different ways you could do it. It's just sort of like, it's fun to drag the lines around. And then if you decide that you connected this to the wrong thing, you can just either drag this off of it, or you could just do right-click on the actual text and do break connection. Again, they all kind of accomplish the same goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Also, what is AI curvature?
So AI curvature is just like a weird sort of utility node. It doesn't render on its own. It just sort of exists. But basically, it's calculating how curved your object is at any given point. And it displays that as like a black and white value, basically.
And where would that be? And how often will we use it?
You will use it pretty much any time you're doing what I'm doing right now.
Okay.
And you find it, if you're in your Hypershade, you hit tab, and then you just search for like curvature. And it should pull it up after like 2 letters. Any other questions? Cool. All right, so there's a bunch of settings, like I said, under the curvature node. We can kind of like play with like how the like quality of the lines. one thing I want to mention really quick, so output is either convex or concave. It's a little bit hard to tell the difference. So concave is going to grab any line. It's good for like dirt stuff, where if you have, you know, grime that's like ground itself into a little corner, like this little corner, it's going to highlight basically just different corners. And then convex is good for, again, hitting outer corners where you would expect material to maybe be worn off. There's also an option for both. I don't necessarily know why you'd need both, but you can select them if you want. But yeah, so that's pretty much the curvature node. If you want a little bit more control over the effect of this, and be like, maybe I'm not quite happy, I want to like push this a little bit farther, you can add an AI range node. So if I just hit tab and then type in range, brings up AI range. And basically what this does is it functions a little bit like a level box in Photoshop, where it'll let you sort of fiddle with values and tweak stuff a little bit like an adjustment layer. So I'm just going to grab the out color from my AI curvature node, throw that into the input of my AI range, and then take the output or out color R from my AI range and replace the mix with that. So now instead of having the AI curvature connected directly to the mix, it's going to a range, which is then going to the mix. And what this allows me to do is, it basically allows me to have a little bit more control over the values. So I'm actually going to do a thing really quick. In case I haven't mentioned this before, this little isolate select button in your Arnold render view, if you click that, it's going to basically render what you have selected at that given time. So if I select my mix, it stopped rendering the background because that's not selected. So if I select my mix shader, it's going to render that. If I select my curvature node, it's showing me exactly what that's doing. If I select the range, showing me what that's doing. It does make it a little bit easier to sort of go through and like see exactly how your textures are behaving and like what you're doing is affecting the texture. So now I'm just kind of going through and like playing with my range, and just sort of figuring out exactly what I want. I'm not gonna, I do find these range things to be really awkward. I just sort of like fumble around in them until I do something that I don't completely despise. But yeah, so I'm just gonna make this maybe a little bit more aggressive to, I guess, make a point. That's awful. All right. Nope. All right, that's kind of almost better-ish, sort of-ish. We're just gonna maybe call this halfway decent for now. All right, close enough. So yeah, so I mean, this is like the basic effect that you can get from the curvature node. So AI range and AI mix shaders, we're gonna be using a lot for the next like 20 minutes. So does anybody have any questions on what I've done here? All right. You can do one more thing for this that is kind of fun. So if I say maybe I like look in on this, and it's a little bit noisy, which makes it just sort of hard to tell. But if I all right. So if I zoom in on this sort of texture area here, you'll notice it's still pretty smooth. Whatever grain that's there is just because of noise in my render. So if I wanted that to be a little bit more chipped, I could basically just add a noise texture into that and combine the noise texture to create basically another map that's going to mask out certain areas. So I'll just show you that because can't type today. So if you're ever looking for like a ramp texture or like a noise texture, anything you would find when you're trying to map a color texture into something kind of thing, that's the texture. You want the texture, not the stencil or the projection. So I'm going to grab noise texture from down here. Now I need to find a way to basically combine these. So I want the curvature node and the noise node to be sort of connected together and basically like turn into one map that the mix shader can use. So to do that, I'm going to essentially treat this like a little bit like a map in Photoshop or like a multiply layer in Photoshop. So Arnold has this So Arnold has this lovely node called AI multiply, which literally just takes one layer and it multiplies it onto the other one. So I'm just going to grab the out color from my noise and the out color from my range and throw them into this multiply texture, and then grab the out color R and replace my mix again. So now this is mapped into even more things. So what I did is probably not going to be super obvious right now. So if you look at it, this is my noise texture on my object. And again, I'm just using isolate select, so when I click on this, it's just showing me what the noise texture looks like. To really make this, oh, I see what I did. To really make this kind of nicer looking, I'm going to tweak some of the settings here. So I might play with, I'll try like frequency ratio, and then I think I'm just going to grab the place 2D texture thing and repeat this like 5 times. So now if I click on my noise, you can see that the texture itself is a lot denser. And there's a lot like sort of finer detail in that noise texture. So if I look at this AI multiply node, and that's a bad example. If I scroll in now, hopefully you should see, or did I hook this up wrong? I think I did. Oh, whoops. All right. I totally hooked these up backwards, I think. If at first you don't succeed, hook it up in the opposite order. That's my actual basic philosophy. But you can see, hopefully it's kind of obvious, where you have like these really subtle areas where it's like lighter and darker in the scratches. It is a little bit more apparent in the base here. So if I look at, this is my default range, and this is with my noise, this is my default range. So if you look like particularly over here, when I go to the AI multiply, you can see that there's a lot more detail and sort of grain in that. That's helping to break up that texture a little bit. So if I go back to my mix shader now, you should see hopefully that the textures around here are a little bit more broken up, a little bit more organic, and that is again just because of that noise texture that I added in there. So I feel like if I push that a little bit. So Arnold actually has their own noise. They have like the Arnold noise texture. I'm gonna try to make this like super obnoxious. Yeah, there we go. So you can see here now if I click on this AI multiply that there's like it's like really cutting out pieces of the grime. And that is providing even that's like a much more organic sort of feel to said grime. If you wanted to, if you were so inclined, you could also add another range node into this. And just throw the out color of your multiply node into the range node, and then the range node in here. And again, this is just like if you want more control over this, you can bump some of the textures around however you please. In this case, I really don't feel like doing that, so I'm just going to connect that back to here. Any questions on this? Like, does this make sense? Cool. So even just doing this, it's like you do accumulate a lot of nodes pretty quickly. So again, ideally you would go back and label your range nodes and your multiply nodes and stuff like that, so that you know what you're clicking on. Because later it's going to turn like super ridiculous, and if you have to sort through stuff, it's kind of annoying. But anyway, so let's assume perhaps now that you are like, awesome, well I have this cool like chippy texture, and I have this strange little scratch texture that I've made. What if I combine these two textures? Because that seems like a fun idea. I said that with so much sarcasm. Actually, one thing you can do, so while I'm here, you can do a similar thing to your scratch texture if you want to, because like I think this is a little bit like too scratchy. So I'm actually going to do pretty much the same thing that I just did, where I'm going to here's my file texture. I'm just going to throw in another noise map. This time I'll try an AI noise. And then I am just going to make another multiply node. Again, I'm going to use this noise texture as a way to mask out parts of my file texture so that the scratches are like a little bit less insane. So I'm going to go to AI multiply and just throw in my colors. So out color into input 1 and out color into input 2, and then this RGB into the mix. So Lord knows what this actually looks like right now. What is this? Ah, I didn't label my mix shader. I know I did. What is this? What? Why is it not labeling it? That's so obnoxious. All right. But anywho, so you can see now that I have this like really awkward. I think I hooked these up backwards, but I have this like very awkward effect where it's like super chromy and, but there are like areas of purple. So I might just go into my noise texture really quick and just sort of fiddle with the settings until they do something a little bit more like what I'm looking for. I usually don't play with the AI noises too much, so I like kind of, whoa. Oh, that's so trippy. That's awesome. It actually feels like a really interesting way to maybe make some kind of like creepy, gnarly tree bark or something. I don't know. So I'm gonna say maybe something like this or something is kind of decentish for what I need to do. And again, I'm mostly just looking for some way to make my scratches a little bit less overpowering. So if I look at this, you can see that it is really sort of fuzzed out those scratches, except in this case I think it's done more or less the opposite of what I was hoping. So I'm gonna see what happens if I swap the inputs here, because I do have a tendency, yeah, okay, so then it's totally one of these. Alright, so I'm just gonna swap color 1 and color 2 and see if that helps. Kind of, sort of, a little bit. Wait, why? Oh, I know why it's, okay. I know why it's doing that. Yeah. All right, so I was looking at this and I'm like, why is this turning everything super white? I'm looking at this and it's trying to multiply it down. So any area that's white, it's ignoring. And any area that's black, it's darkening. So I actually want this texture to be inverted. So I'm just gonna click on my file texture, and for some reason they don't have the effects tab in the Hypershade. So I'm gonna go down to my file, effects, invert, and now it's black. User error. So now if I look at my multiply node, theoretically it's gonna be doing something much more similar to what I want, where the scratches are much less intense. You'll just notice that I need to now switch my car paint shaders and stuff, because I have now messed up the colors of that again. But if I swap that back, now my scratches are kind of a little bit less obnoxious, maybe. If I take that down a little bit, it's going to make the scratches even less apparent. So in this case, I think this maybe looks a little bit more natural, kind of, sort of. So I'm going to leave it with this. So if I now wanted to actually combine these together, so I have like the scratches with the chromey stuff here, I'm going to need to make, shockingly, another mix node. I'm gonna get rid of this guy because he's annoying. Actually, no I don't. I lied, sorry, I don't actually need to make another mix node. I need to grab the mix node for my edge scratches. I'm just gonna drag that down here. And basically what I'm gonna do, since they're using the same colors, both of them are using the car paint and the chrome, it doesn't really matter which order I attach these together with. So I'm just going to basically, I'll just use the paint color because I like replacing the paint color for some reason. I'll find car paint, and that's in shader 1, and I'm just going to grab the output of this mix shader and replace it with shader 1. And I should also apply this to my object. But you can see that by doing that, it's basically putting like the chromey scratches on the edges over this material, which has the scratches here. So it's basically, instead of putting it over just car paint, it's putting it over the car paint and the scratches that exist, which is how you get this sort of scratchy and chromey effect at the same time. It occurs to me that this was a weird idea to bring the noise down. But anywho. So this is pretty much what you're left with, scratchy stuff with wiggly stuff around the edge. So any questions on any of this so far? All right. There's like 2 more things I want to show you in Arnold, and then we'll hop into Redshift. And the next thing I want to show you guys is how to add grime to things. So I'm just going to clear that really quick. So there's 2 ways of adding grime. The first one, so you, remember when I first made the curvature node? Textures, curvature. So there's like this concave versus convex. You can play with that, and you can use this, just switch it to concave, and you can add Grime with this. Or you can use the Ambient Occlusion node. So hit tab, type in Ambient Occlusion, and you're looking for AI Ambient Occlusion. So really quick, I know I've gone over this like at least briefly before, but this is basically what Ambient Occlusion does. It's just a way to basically add in extra shadows. They use it a lot. You'll bake like ambient occlusion maps for creating game assets and that kind of stuff. But you'll create this map, or what am I saying? The closer things are together, the more shadowed it tends to be. So it is good for getting areas like down in here where there's like little subtle shadows, or like right in here, it'll like really push those shadows to be deep if you use this as a multiply map over whatever your final render is. But that's basically all it does, is it just sort of creates a little black and white image of basically mapping where things are close together. So the closer it is, the darker it is. That's really all this is doing. It is also a really nice way to get nice shadows, like when an object is sitting on a table. But same way as everything else, you can modify like the spread and the fall off and do a bunch of other crazy random things to this. I usually find it to be kind of awkward and hard to work with, to be honest. If you do need to modify the samples, you can do that if it's coming across like crazy grainy. But anyway, so we're going to be using the Curvature node. So I'm going to make another mix shader, shockingly. Alright. And then I'm going to attach this. So this is going to be, I'm shooting for rust on this material, so I'm going to throw in my car paint, throw in my really ugly rust texture that I have, and then basically use my ambient occlusion to mix these dudes together. So again, I need to grab RGB because out color has 3 values and mix only wants 1. So I'm going to grab this and just throw that on my dude. That's not a thing. Aha. So, oh lordy. So this is what it gives me by default, which is not what I want. This looks a little ridiculous. So what I want, usually if I do an ambient occlusion, I find them kind of hard to control on their own, so you do usually need to add in like some kind of range node in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and attach that in. And now what I can do is, I'm hitting isolate select, I see. So I'm just going to play with my input and output again. And you can see that by doing that, it's creating a very different effect here, where it's actually almost making a dust effect. I'm going to go over how to do a proper dust effect in a sec, but you can play with those values. And once again, I have input the things in the wrong order. Every time. Do you ever have those feelings where it's like, you try to guess at something and you're like, I guessed wrong again, and then you just give up? Anyway, that's me with inputting stuff into these shaders. So basically, I'm just looking for like a nice little layer of rust, maybe like under here, or in an area where you'd expect, some drips or something, and like not a lot of stuff is going to touch that area, so the rust is going to stay there and kind of exist. So in this case, like the underside of the ball, and in these little areas. So if I look at my mix shader now, you can see that the rust is much more heavily concentrated at the bottom, but it still looks, honestly, this looks cool. Not the effect I'm going for though. So I'm just going to like keep clamping that value down until this behaves maybe a little bit more like I want it to. And if I don't feel like toggling back and forth, I can just turn off the isolate render. So I just render everything, and then I can just play with this. All right. So in this case, it looks like output max is really like clamping that value down so that the rust is sort of hanging out only on the bottom of stuff. But that's more or less the way to add rust to things. So again, there's 2 ways to do that. You can use the curvature node and just set it to concave, or you can use the ambient occlusion shader. It just depends on what you need. Ambient occlusion shader. So ambient occlusion shaders will give you like this really diffuse sort of rust covering everything on the bottom down here and like this whole area in here. The convex curvature is going to give you really tight little rust areas in creases. So I find those better for like tiny dusts sometimes. But if I wanted to, I could also go back in and like break this up with a noise texture. Again, just using a multiply node to do that. Any questions on this? All right. Anyone want to see me demo putting the noise texture in to break this up? Cool. One person, that's all it takes. All right. Ouch. After I untangle myself from my mic cord really quick. Hang on. Ouch. All right. So I'm just gonna reuse the same noise texture I've been. All right. So I'm just gonna make this noise texture. I'm gonna make another multiply. Another AI multiply, because they are my favorite node ever. And I'm just going to, again, map these into each other. So I'm basically just going to use this noise texture to squish down and get rid of some of the rust, because it does look perhaps a little bit ridiculous. So I'm going to turn isolate select back on. Bless you. And just play with my noise texture a little bit. So maybe blah. I'm still like trying to learn exactly how AI noise works. I find it kind of awkward. But I don't know, maybe something kind of like this wouldn't be horrible. So like this is my multiply node, and that looks super questionable. That's not what I wanted. So half of doing this is just sort of getting used to troubleshooting like weird issues that you're having. Oh. Huh. Grumble. All right. So the issue, again, is that this is mostly white, and this is black down here. So the area that I'm actually trying to cut out is already pretty much the darkest it can be. So I'm just going to try and swap these around. And actually, what is this? So I'm actually just going to go into my Ambient Occlusion node and set the black to white and the white to black, and now I have a reverse of what I had. So hopefully, when I look now at my multiply node, this is kind of more like what I wanted. Ah. And once again, I need to switch my mix shader around. I was right the first time. How do you like them apples? I do find it kind of satisfying to like input the stuff in here. But anywho. So again, you can see that this does it like breaks up my rust a little bit, and I think makes it look kind of nicer. It still feels maybe like weirdly, I think after I swap the textures, I need to like go back in and like smash the crap out of some of these values a little bit. Oh god. I am not a Photoshop-minded person, and these make me sad when I need to do things with them. And I've gotten rid of my texture. Amazing. Anyway, I'm just gonna, yeah, great. Cool, it's rust. But yeah. So that's pretty much more or less adding rust. Again, normally you'd kind of refine this a little bit more, but for the sake of demo, I feel like it kind of works. Any questions on this? All right. So the last thing I have is how to add dust to things. And that's more convoluted in the setup itself. It's not terrible, just like, I guess, a little bit, maybe less apparent how it works. So I'm going to create yet another mix node, mix shader, keep calling it the wrong thing. And I'm going to name this mix dust. It also occurs to me that I haven't been labeling my stuff, which is stupid. You'll see why in like 5 minutes. But anywho, so I have this mix, and I'm gonna say, cool, I wanna throw some dust on top of my car paint. I give up. I'm not even gonna try to guess. I'm just gonna do something. And I'm gonna throw my mix shader on here. Click my object. So yeah. So what you want to do for mix shaders, to add dust on this. So when dust falls, it usually collects only on the top of objects because it, falls down with the gravities and then it sits there. And it's like, obviously it's not going to stick on the bottom of stuff or like on the sides, it's going to fall off. So there's a node called AI Utility, and there's 2 settings in here that you need to change, but basically you can convert this to looking at the normal position of your object, which I'll go over that in like 2 seconds. So again, AI Utility node, you're going to want to set shade mode to flat and color mode to normal. And what this will do, if I make another AI standard surface shader, I'm just going to throw the output into the color of this, and then throw the shader onto here so that you can see what it's actually doing. I kind of regret not making this a Lambert. In case you didn't know, once you made a shader, you can switch the type of shader in this little type thing. A lot of times it'll unlink your textures, like you can see it just ripped out the color channel, but it has swapped it. So this is pretty much what it looks like. And all this is really doing, and this is like how normal maps, and pretty much anything you see that says normal, more or less how it works, it's basically assigning a color value to each axes of the, like the X, Y, and Z axis. So if you look down here at this little little axis in the bottom left, the colors correspond actually to the colors that the axes are marked on that little handle. So Y is green. So it might be a little bit hard to see, but the top of this and like any surface that's facing directly upwards is going to be have a green value to it. Some value between 0 if it's not facing Y at all, and 255 if it's completely facing Y. X is usually denoted by red, so anything facing the positive X is going to be redder. And then same thing with Z. Z is blue. Anything facing positive Z is going to be blue. So if you're ever looking at a normal map for something like like this, this isn't like the most fantastic example of a normal map, but if you ever looked at it and you're like, wow, why are these all crazy purple trippy colors? That's why. So like the color values are basically all just combining. Each channel for RGB is basically telling the computer, slightly, it's like pinpointing the direction that normal is facing based on the color value. So they do just combine to make really ridiculous colors. Any questions on that, like how normal maps work or how normals work? All right. So I'm going to trash my Lambert, and then I am going to add in wait for it, an AI multiply node. And I'm going to use this, I guess a little bit differently. Basically, I'm going to take my output color of the AI utility, put that into input 1, and then input 2, I'm going to set that to be pure green. You can just click this little green thing here. If you're ever concerned about it, just set your mode to RGB, and just make sure that red and blue are both 0 and green is 255, pure green. I will apply my mix shader to this. And then once you've done that, so I'm just going to apply this and see what happens. I have no faith that this is going to turn out well. And actually before I've just been saying like apply whatever random out color to this, it doesn't matter. Pick any one. If you're working with grayscale stuff, that does make sense and is totally fine. If you are working with something like the AI utility with normals, where it is color dependent, you do actually need to pay attention to the color that you're using. So in this case, we've been working with green because we want our dust falling from the top. So I'm going to grab out color green, throw it into a mix. And you can, dang it, I got the colors wrong again. I will never not make fun of myself for that. But you can kind of see that the top of this is purple. In this case, it's basically purple falling down onto dust, which is not what I want, but you can see that pretty much anywhere facing upwards is shaded purple. So in this case, I am going to, once again, swap my colors out. I kind of wish there was a button for that, honestly. Like, that would be great. And dust. Huzzah. So this looks really gross, and not at all like what I want. So anyone have any idea what I'd add to get more control of the colors? Huzzah. Yeah, AI range. I love a good AI range. And when I say love, I mean it's love-hate. They do what I need them to do, but I do find them very awkward to control. So again, I'm just going to plug out color of my multiply into the input of my range, and out color green this time into my mix shader. And so now I'm looking at this with isolate select on my render turned on. So I'm looking directly at this range, and I'm just going to randomly start doing things until something happens. Nah. this is questionable seeming. Oh, okay. I see, my render was just not updating. That's nice of it. Anywho. So I'm just gonna clamp this down. And again, like, totally could refine this more, but mostly just to make a point here. These are so awkward. Anywho. If you ever, for some reason, I can't actually seem to get it right now. I'm not really trying to, but if you guys ever find this like popping up weird purple colors or something like that, if you click smooth step, it'll usually get rid of that. But anywho. So I'm just gonna like try to clamp this down into something that kind of looks dusty-ish, maybe. And if I go back to my mix shader now, it may not be like crazy obvious. There's like a little bit of sort of fuzz at the top. Oh god. I really don't like AI range nodes. Anywho. I want to like actually get like a halfway decent demo of this for you guys. Okay, I don't know. I don't know if you can actually see that at all. It's not what I want. But there is like a very, very subtle layer of dust on there. If I go back in and I change this to like something ridiculous, that was a stupid choice. So like blue, you can see that there is like a blue layer of dust on the top of this sphere. So any questions about this? All right. Cool. So now I'm going to show you guys how to combine all of these together. So if you want to get something like this weird little shader ball I have, where it has like paint with scratches and rust and dust, how to combine all of this stuff together to get that. It's pretty much just connecting your mix nodes together until you have no more to connect. But basically, you actually, for this one, you actually don't need to create another mix node. So I'm just going to grab, this is kind of layer dependent. So I kind of like to think of it as like a pyramid, kind of. But eventually you're going to have a single mix node that's going to be applied to your object. So whatever is attached to that, basically closest or like most recent to that mix node, is going to be what's rendered last and on top of everything else. The stuff further down the chain is going to be what's rendered first. A little bit like a pyramid, like where the most stuff, like widest stuff at the bottom, you got to put that down first before you get to the top. Kind of the same principle. So in this case, I think it makes sense for the rust to be first, or I'm sorry, for the dust to show up on top of everything else. So I'm going to, whoops. Just important tidbit in case I didn't say it. Make sure that you don't accidentally, like in an attempt to stop this displaying down here, don't hit delete. It will literally get rid of your texture, and I do it all the time, and then I kick myself for it later. So I'm gonna grab my mix for my dust. No. I think Maya died. I'm not gonna lie, I'm really surprised it got this far, because last class it crashed like twice during every one of those demos I was trying to do. So this is a huge improvement in my opinion. Alright, I'm gonna force quit Maya. It's gonna get real weird now. Every just like 5 seconds it's gonna start crashing. But anywho, so if you guys are ever doing stuff like this, again, you can add more detailed textures. So if you wanted like a bubbled paint texture or like, chipped wallpaper or something like that, you can add more maps to the individual textures, which is what makes this so powerful, because it's so easy to swap between textures without, going back in and manually changing like 8 Photoshop layers worth of stuff. Save my set project. Yes. If you guys ever encounter the weird, too many versions. The weird thing where like Maya crashes and doesn't set your project. What is this? This is not my most recent. Where is it? No. What is this? What is this file? Hang on. Sorry. Oh, I see. I have bad naming conventions, and I'm just like, what file am I even looking for right now? All right. So But yeah, if you guys ever find the weird thing where like Maya crashes and it doesn't save your, oh, there we go. It doesn't save your set project. For some reason, it like only remembers that your project was set if you close Maya yourself and then reopen it. If it force quits or crashes, it like doesn't save your set project, at least on any computer I've ever worked on, which is super annoying, honestly. But anywho. So like I said, I'm going for dust on top, so I have my dust texture down here. Conveniently, it's already applied to my shader. Basically, what I'm just going to do is go through and a little bit the same thing like I did for the scratches. So in this case, like, dust is fine where it is, but instead of replacing just the car paint, I want it replacing the scratched car paint. So I'm going to find wherever the heck I put that. Base, edge scratches, rust, texture scratches. So I think it was this one. Yes, good. So I'm going to find this one. This is the combined shader with both of the scratches on it, like the scratched edges and the general scratches. So I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to just throw that into my dust shader. Wait for it. All right, so out color, and I'm just going to replace shader 1, which is my car paint. And you can see that once I've done that, I have this awkward blue alien dust covering scratchy paint. Does this make sense? Cool. So now if I wanted that rust to show up, I just need to decide where exactly I want it to show up. I usually end up, for some reason, throwing it under my scratches. But I mean, I could just like rejigger this if I want. So, all right, if I want this, say I want the rust over my scratches. Actually, that's gonna be like a whole lot of hooking stuff up. No, I want it under my scratches. I changed my mind. So if I want the rust to show up down here, I'm just going to click on my edge scratch here, and I'm actually, so you'll notice that this is actually already mapped over my texture scratch mix, which means I actually need to go into my texture scratch, and you'll see that now I just have car paint. So if I grab my rust from there, I can just drag that down and replace car paint. And now I have sort of rusty scratched metal. And if I look at my dust texture, you can see I have scratches everywhere, rust, and dust. Does this make sense? Cool. But yeah, so I mean that's like more or less procedural texturing. You can just keep layering these onto each other in like super crazy ways. And it might take a little bit of fiddling with it to figure out which order stuff makes sense in. But honestly, it's a relatively non-destructive way to work. And the reason, in case anyone was curious, why I said it's good to label your things. So this is the final, here is my, my final mix. This is all the other stuff attached to it. So if this weren't labeled, I would literally just be sitting here banging my head against the wall, being like, why have I done these things? Ooh. Yeah, so this is like crazy. Like again, if this stuff weren't labeled, at least the textures, I would be nuts by now. And this is like, honestly, I could get way more ridiculous with this. I'm just not going to. I think I broke my render again. But at least it's responsive now. But yeah, so that's pretty much procedural texturing in Arnold. I think that's pretty much anything you need for this week. Any questions? Cool. While I'm here, I'm actually curious. I'm actually just going to close my Hypershade. So there is a way, and I've never personally tested it because Maya crashed last class when I tried. But there is a way to make pixelated textures. Or like pixelated, if you want to make pixel art of a character or whatever, and you want to like make them in Maya and then just have it generate pixel art for you. Apparently, if you go to your just like settings for stuff in Arnold for your sampling, if you take camera AI down to like -3, this is your render. It just pretty much just gives you pixel art. If you set this to like 0 or a negative value. I mean, don't do this if you want your render to look nice, but like if I set this to -10, that was maybe a bad decision. If I set this to -5, this is my render. Like it will literally just kick you out pixel art. And you can, you know, rotate around this, and it just, like, gives you pretty much a perfectly rotating pixel art thing if I haven't crashed the render. And it's kind of like a fun, silly thing to play with, I guess. If you're into, like, it might be an interesting way to make game assets, depending on what you need. Anywho. Fun tidbit of the day. Hopefully.